Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. I'm convinced that if we as Christians hope to cultivate the culture and sow the seed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we must understand the big ideas that have shaped the worldview of the people around us. Today I'm joined by Leroy Hill and Owen Anderson as we explore how Rene Descartes' old ideas on reason and reality have shaped the waters of identity we swim in. If you want to do some homework before these monthly discussions, pick up a copy of Benjamin Wiker's book, 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. We'll cover one chapter at a time, so it's easy enough to read along. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Before I join the guys for our discussion, let's start with a short biography of Descartes that I've adapted from the Harvard Classics, Volume 34. Rene Descartes was born in La Haye in the French province of Touraine on March 31st, 1596. Descartes' family was really well off. They owned a lot of land with possessions in Brittany, the northeastern part of France, as well as in the south. His education began at a Jesuit college, continued at Paris, and was completed as he traveled to various countries, which included several years of military service. Descartes was distinguished in physics and mathematics as well as in philosophy, and his geometry revolutionized the study of that science. After Descartes began to devote himself to philosophy, he lived chiefly in Holland, but the last 5 months of his life were spent in Stockholm at the court of Queen Christina of Sweden, where he died on February 11th, 1650. In his early days, Descartes became deeply dissatisfied with the scholastic philosophy which still survived in the teaching of the Jesuits from whom he received his early training. He adopted a skeptical attitude of life. Then he set out on his travels, determined to gain knowledge only from himself and the great books of the world, from nature and the observation of man. In his writings, Descartes recounts how he came to Germany, where the idea of "I think, therefore I am" came to him. On this idea, he built a philosophy which is usually regarded as the foundation of modern thought. Not that Descartes' system itself is fully accepted today, but the sweeping away of presuppositions of all kinds and the method which he proposed for the discovery of truth have made possible the whole modern philosophic development. It was in this discourse, originally published in 1637, that this method was first presented to the world, and it is this method we'll explore today through the lens of the Christian worldview. With Descartes' biography in mind, let me take a minute to summarize the key themes of his book. The full title, which is a mouthful, is Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason and Seeking for the Truth in the Sciences. So that's a lot to take in, but here's where it boils down to. There's 6 parts. In part 1, Descartes details his skepticism of the science, philosophy, and theology of his day, highlighting their lack of certainty and practical application. He argues that we need a more reliable foundation for knowledge, which leads him to discard all previous beliefs and start from scratch. He emphasizes the importance of a methodical approach to reasoning grounded in doubt and systematic inquiry to achieve certainty and true knowledge. And in the broad scheme of things, that's a pretty good start to his ideas. In part 2, Descartes presents the 4 key precepts central to his method for discovering reliable knowledge. First, never accept anything as true unless it is evident beyond doubt. Second, simplify complex problems to better understand and solve them. Third, order thoughts from the simplest to the most complex, starting with known truths, and then methodically build on those ideas. Fourth, review to ensure no details are forgotten or left out. This method, he argues, allows for the gradual construction of a reliable body of knowledge free from errors and uncertainties. In part 3 of his discourse, Descartes presents a provisional moral code to guide his actions while he constructs his new system of knowledge. His code of conduct consists of 4 maxims. First, obey the laws and custom of one's country in order to maintain social harmony and avoid unnecessary conflict. Second, once a decision is made, act resolutely and consistently because indecision and inaction is worse than making mistakes. Third, conquer your desires and accept the limits of your power rather than changing the world to fit personal desires. And fourth, regardless of your profession, dedicate your life to cultivating reason and seeking truth through the sciences. So these 4 precepts of his provisional morality supports his ultimate goal of establishing a more certain foundation for knowledge based on reason and methodical inquiry. In part 4, Descartes outlines his famous process of radical doubt and the foundational conclusion he reaches, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes begins by doubting everything that can possibly be doubted, including the evidence of the senses and the existence of the physical world. This systematic doubt leads him to realize that while he can doubt everything else, he cannot doubt that fact that he is doubting. From this process of radical doubt, Descartes concludes that his existence as a thinking being is undeniable. From this, he argues for the existence of a perfect, infinite being by reasoning that the idea of a perfection and infinity must have originated from a being who truly possesses those attributes. This perfect being, or God, would not deceive him. Therefore, Descartes says, he can trust his perceptions. In part 5, Descartes outlines some of his scientific discoveries and thoughts about the natural world. He describes his work in physiology, particularly his theories about the circulation of blood and the functioning of the heart, which rely to some degree on William Harvey's discoveries, along with observations of other heat systems and possibly even alchemy. Descartes explains the body as a machine governed by the mechanical laws and discusses the role of the soul, which he believes resides in the pineal gland, right there in the middle of our brain. Descartes addresses the relationship between the animals and humans. He argues that animals lack rational souls and function purely as complex machines without consciousness or reasoning. Humans, however, possess reason and the capacity for speech, setting them apart from other animals. And in this 5th part, I think his ideas, for me as a Christian, start to fall apart. With a hint of proto-deism, Descartes touches on cosmology and the formation of the earth, suggesting a mechanistic and, dare I say, evolutionary explanation for the development of the universe, the planets, and the stars. Finally, in part 6 of his discourse, Descartes reflects on the purpose and implications of his philosophical and scientific work. He emphasizes the importance of practical applications of knowledge for improving life. Descartes highlights the role of science and technology in providing benefits such as better health and deeper understanding of the natural world. This final part of his book serves as a call to action for future thinkers to embrace his method, discover what is true, and use this knowledge to benefit society. So with Descartes' biography and the background of his book in mind, let's bring in Leroy Hill, my normal co-host, and then our special guest today, Owen Anderson. And I'll start by letting him introduce himself to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to join both of you and looking forward to our discussion. I'm a philosophy professor at Arizona State University, and I work in the area of philosophy of religion. So I'm interested in Descartes' approach to knowing God and God's existence. And I've also been working on a commentary on his meditations to help students go through what are some of the key ideas. How is he rejecting Aristotle on the one hand, and how is he arguing for our knowledge of God on the other?
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see because, I've read Descartes before. I'm no educated philosopher, not to the same way you are. I teach enough and know enough to be dangerous in that world. So we'll see if your take is different. We might have some friction today. We might break out in fights. Who knows?
That's what people check in for. That's what they want.
Yeah, exactly. Leroy, do you want to jump in?
It's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting because as I was, kind of reading through him, I just saw that he was in deep conflict with Aristotle. Fundamentally in conflict with Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, well, let's see what comes out of that. So let's just jump right in then with our first worldview question. And Owen, I'm going to actually throw it to you on this one after I set this up here, just to give you the first crack as a guest here. But this question of how we came into being, and the way I usually approach this is not just as a personal, where did I come from, but in this bigger picture of, is there a God? Did Descartes even believe there's a God? Is he an atheist? Is he agnostic? Is he a Christian? Is he full-on Christian, or is he just a broad theist? Where would we want to put Descartes in our thinking?
Yeah, that's a great first question to start about worldviews, because on the one hand, the way you're kind of phrasing it is, where'd I come from because, or the material world, because it had a beginning, which is to say it's temporal. But that means we're also asking the other question, which is what had no beginning? Is there anything that's eternal, that's just always existed? And that's where you really get the differences between worldviews. Sometimes Christians get the idea that there's just basically theists and materialists. But there are a couple other views that are important to consider. For example, philosophical Hinduism, which became popular in Europe about 100 years after Descartes. And that teaches that all things are God. Essentially, all things are eternal. There's no asking the question where I come from. In one sense, doesn't make any sense because everything's always existed. And so Descartes, though, falls squarely on the theistic side. He's a Christian. In fact, he was a soldier in the Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War on the Catholic side, French Catholic. But that was some of the things that got him to start questioning, because he realized that both sides of that conflict believe the Bible is true. And so it's not enough in that conflict to say, well, I'm on the side of thinking the Bible's true and the other guys are pagans. No, these both think the Bible's true. And so that got him thinking. And then the other thing that got him thinking was what was at his time called the new science, which now we take for granted. But the idea that Greek science was completely inaccurate and mistaken, whether it's about the cosmos or about how the world works or about medicine. And you have scientists beginning to study the world through the empirical method. Let me give you an example. Aristotle said that objects of different size, if you drop them, the heavier one falls faster than the lighter one. And he never bothered, and no one ever bothered for about 1,500 years to just go outside and drop stuff and measure how fast it falls. And that should be mind-blowing. Like, no one ever thought to actually check it out because it's not true. Objects fall at the same rate if you take away wind resistance. So a feather doesn't fall fast, but it has wind resistance. But if you have two marbles of different weights, they fall at the same speed. So Newton begins noticing these kinds of things. And so you have the new science coming out. And Descartes wants to defend that against Aristotle. But also, I think it's unfortunate that many Christians rely on Aristotle because the proofs that he gives for God's existence, this is not God. The unmoved mover, sure, he had no beginning. That's similar to God, but he's completely impersonal. He's aware of nothing but himself. He doesn't providentially act in the world. This is a pagan deity that many other pagan religions believed in as well. This is not Jehovah. And it's not that there's a conflict between the Bible and philosophy. It's that this is a Greek idol. And using Aristotle's arguments can only get you as far as that Greek idol. And so what Descartes wants to do is Descartes wants to say, let's actually show God exists. And I'm going to start with nothing and see what I can know from there. And so it really is a revolutionary moment. And that's why he's considered to be the first modern philosopher, because he really does begin asking questions that hadn't been asked in centuries.
Yeah. So do you think, and then we'll throw it to you in a second here, Leroy, too, and get your thoughts on this. So Owen, do you think that, so for those listening, so you believe he would fall in a solidly historically Christian category, or would he just be a theist broadly speaking? Where do you think he fits in that? Where does he come down in that?
Yep. I believe he thinks he's defending Christianity, and I don't know that his personal life. Now, did he make a profession of faith in Christ? I don't know. But compared to some later philosophers, for example, Hegel, who uses Christian terminology, but he's purposely changing the meaning to be like the Vedas. So he's using Hindu philosophy, but using Christian terminology. Descartes' not like that. He really thinks he's defending Christianity and the belief in God, the Creator, specifically. I'm more familiar. Locke is more well known for specifically defending Christianity in the Bible. Descartes may have done that, and I just don't know.
Yeah, I wasn't really. Leroy, what is your take on that? Where do you think he falls based on your reading?
I think Dr. Owen Anderson is dead on. I mean, his ethics, his metaphysics, his epistemology, his metaphysics and epistemology both work together. They almost run into each other. But when you get to his ethics, that you have to ask the question: what kind of God is is necessary for Descartes' system, right? And the only kind of God that works for Descartes' system is one that is the fount of morality, the fount of knowledge, the one that doesn't believe in deception or doesn't argue for deception. And the only kind of God that would fit in his system is, the Christian God. I think it's a good question to ask, where he's coming from. I think the great point that you raised with Aristotle is an example of this. So, for example, many of us want to look at Aristotle today and see, because he's arguing similarly to how we might argue about God, to immediately make the leap into saying that he's talking about the Christian God, when the reality is, he's not. It reminds me of a more modern conversation we have when we talk about ID, intelligent design. The intelligent design, scientists will tell you, they're not arguing for a Christian God per se, right? They're arguing for some conception of God, but it's up to the Christian to make the connection to the conception of God that they're arguing for. So in many ways, it's similar. Whereas I think Descartes' system wouldn't work unless he has a Christian conception of God firmly ensconced right at its foundation.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask this. This is interesting. So here's a quote. I want to read from this quote from the book, and whoever wants to jump in on this quote and take it. This is the book that we're using, that Wiker's book, 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. He says this: Descartes attacked skepticism, but only by denying reality. He confirmed the idea of the immaterial soul against the pronouncements of the crass materialists of the day, but only by recreating us as insubstantial ghosts trapped in chattering machines. He proved God's existence, but only by making it depend on our thinking him into existence. So what do you think? What do you think about that quote, that summary? Does that seem like fair? A little bit too broad brush? What does Descartes do with a human soulishness and the physical, the immaterial part, and how much of God's existence depends on our capacity to envision God?
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes you wonder if he's talking about Descartes. I don't want to be unsympathetic and say he hasn't read Descartes, but for these kinds of things about the soul and the body and God, keep in mind Descartes following Augustine very closely. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, Augustine is the one who said, "I think, therefore I am." And Augustine's the one who said, "I want to set out and doubt things and figure out what I can know." So none of that is true to him. And Augustine also believes the world has two substances, matter and spirit. So I don't know what you guys are around, because I'm in a secular setting, but I'm around a secular setting that blames every problem in the modern world on Descartes. And so let me kind of set that up for you. And I think this falls into that. But basically, if you got an unfair speeding ticket, well, that was because of Descartes separating the mind and the body. Whatever bad things happened to you. But that wasn't Descartes, right? That was Augustine and really Paul and the Bible. So that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense of the history of ideas. Let me give an idea of what an example. Try to give a steel man of what they're saying. They're saying that Descartes made the material world into an object, and that allowed the Europeans to view other humans as objects and exploit them for labor or for resources. Now, that did happen, but it doesn't follow from what Descartes said, because other humans have minds also. And so I always get confused about this. Now, I think Descartes makes some philosophical mistakes. I don't think he's a perfect philosopher, but he also isn't the guy that ruined the last 500 years. And he is closely trying to argue for the theistic God. I mean, Aristotle is not a theist. So whatever's similar between the two, he's trying to argue for the theistic God. He was sympathetic to biblical religion. Again, I don't know about his personal piety, but the idea that we have a mind and a body doesn't set up this problem of objects with the world, and it doesn't make us a ghost stuck in a machine. So that's my take, but I like to hear what you guys do.
Leroy, jump in, man.
Yeah, I was wondering if you thought, and I think this is a good point to raise. I think what happens when we read philosophers is we spend a lot of time looking at the results of their ideas rather than first understanding the people in their own context and understanding what they were trying to do. It may be the case that others came along and built on and said, if we really accept this idea, then it ultimately leads here. But that doesn't for sure prove that the original philosopher who expounded the ideas is exactly saying, let's go there, right? Because the thing that really sticks out to me about Descartes is, I started wondering, what's his connection to deconstructionism, right? And what's his connection, to Marxism, because they tackle some of the same subjects. But the point isn't to say that Descartes, is preaching deconstructionism or teaching deconstructionism or Marxism. He's hundred some odd years, hundreds of years removed from them. But it may be that later people come and wrestle with their ideas and find some kind of justification from an argument that he's made. But it doesn't mean that he's making that case. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I struggle with I do see when I read Descartes. Again, I know that we can look at the consequences of what somebody had and separate that out from original ideas. But even when I was reading through his whole discourses here and trying to process all of his ideas, I do think he ends up creating this sort of, at least the potential for us to see ourselves as the sort of creators of identity in some degree, right? We become masters of that to some extent. And I guess my struggle with that, especially when we answer that question, where did I come from? How did I get here? That Cartesian dualist kind of idea does seem to allow for the mind to create the sense of reality in which, because maybe we'll get to some of this later, but I know he quotes about talking about how, if I can imagine that I can exist in a certain state where something doesn't exist, therefore that thing doesn't exist. And I don't need, if I can imagine that I exist without this body, without this geographic location, therefore those things don't exist. All that exists is me, the I, the thinking person behind that. And I think that pushes, at least that opens the door long term for us today when we have a lot of the ideas that our thoughts shape our identity. That's the core of what shapes our identities, our own thinking about ourselves. So if our origin in part becomes dependent on our thinking about our origin, then I think that, is it fair to say, Owen, at least it opens the door to that, whether he liked that or not, or whether he would agree with that, where it ends up? You think he opens the door to
he would
thinking
reject
that way?
that altogether because he believes the material world exists outside of minds. So that's what's so puzzling about that quote. He doesn't think that he makes God by thinking about God. He just the opposite. He thinks God's a necessary being that can't not exist. And so when he's going through his imagination, what he's saying is, are the things I think true? Are they merely my opinions? Could they be something I made up in my imagination or I had a dream about? And he rules those out. So you really couldn't you couldn't blame Descartes for identity politics or confusions about what you are, because he would say, no, there's a thing that exists outside of us called reason. And it's not based on what I think it is. It is what it is. And I can use reason to figure out about reality, which also exists outside my mind, and about myself, who I am and what I am. So he doesn't say you create all those things. That sounds more like, someone like Foucault later, who would think those things, who denies, ultimately, they're kind of almost solipsists if they're consistent, because they just believe in their own thoughts and there's nothing outside of them. But Descartes would definitely not agree with the things that you just said about ourselves.
Yeah.
Do you think it would have been helpful? I mean, I don't know. Obviously these questions arise much later after his thought. But do you think it would have been helpful if at the beginning he made some kind of argument or statement about the reality of the real world? Whereas, saying that I think therefore I am. That's a statement that exists in a place and time, in history, in space, right? It isn't, like as some would argue, my mind in a vat somewhere. I'm assuming some things when I make that statement. And I think one of the things that a lot of detractors of his do is they believe that he's this guy who creates this, vast system, but he doesn't assume that his mind is in the real world, working, in time, space, and history. So they kind of make the argument as if his discussion takes place without that thought or that kind of thinking, already
Yeah.
figured in.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point to make for sure. Kind of going back to the 30 Years' War in Europe between Protestants and Catholics, one of the things that you'll notice about thinkers at this time is that they're looking for the universal. So they want to find out what's common to all humans. And since Scripture no longer solves that problem, because you got Protestants and Catholics both affirming Scripture, although technically that's not true. The Protestants are affirming Scripture, the Catholics are affirming the Pope's interpretation of Scripture, and that's the Protestants' point, of course, is no, that's your interpretation of the Scripture contradicts the Bible. So that's certainly there. But the idea is you'll see a lot of them going to ask, we need to find what natural theology teaches and what natural law teaches. And so it is true, Descartes looking for the universal. He doesn't think of himself as a mere abstraction. He knows he exists in a temporal body that has senses that change. But part of what he's looking for is, what could everybody know? What could Roman Catholics and Protestants both know and agree on? And since it can no longer be the canon law of the church, it's got to be natural law or natural theology. So now what you're bringing up, Leroy, is really important. There's been an emphasis on more embodied epistemology and recognizing our situatedness, because we're dealing with different problems than Descartes. But that doesn't mean Descartes, if he dealt with those same problems, wouldn't have said those things. It just wasn't the big issue of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. So maybe just to build on that, he talks about in part 5, the 2 tests for humanity. And he talks about the language tests. Animals lack thought, the ability to create unique ideas apart from environmental experiences such as pain. Okay, so that's sort of that side of things. Then there's this action test where animals lack reason, the ability to transfer knowledge from one circumstance to an unfamiliar circumstance. And regarding those,
you'll get me arguing against him.
Okay, well, yeah. So
I'm an animal lover, so you'll get me riled up on this point.
Okay, well, that's what I want to get you fired up, and so that'll be a good thing. So I have this quote. It was really interesting because I was looking at it when I was reading through that part 5. I was like, man, I did not like that part either. So I started to do some digging, and I found this article, a journal article from the 1964. It was written by a guy named Keith Gunderson in Philosophy magazine. He said, regarding Descartes' 2 tests of mind, he says, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that many mechanistic features of Descartes' philosophy of mind have much in common with various physicalistic and behavioristic views which have been supported by the logical positivists." Now, I threw in 3 big words, and we talked to show prep. I'm trying to make this low cookies on the shelf for people, and I throw in physicalist, I throw in positivist, and behavioristic, right? So here I am making it hard.
Let's put animals then, because people love little cute videos about cats or something, right? That's what my Instagram feed is. Either videos about jiu-jitsu or videos about cute cats, because I'm either texting my friends about jiu-jitsu or my wife with videos of cute cats. So, I think actually Descartes is 100% right about the language test. And I use that in class because most of my students have been raised on Disney. And so they're inclined to think that when you leave the room, all the animals start talking to each other. And they have minds just like ours, and they process all the world just like us. Or when you leave the room, the toys start doing this. And so the truth of the matter is animals don't do that. If they have a language, it's not a rational language. It's a different sort of language. Mostly it involves communication through alerting, like, hey, danger. But they don't have a grammar that you could learn. So I love my pets, but it's not that there's a language barrier between me and my pets where I could learn the grammar of cat and tortoise, and then they could speak to each other, but they don't have it. But then, because Descartes, I think this quote is accurate, his view of animals then is that they're just bodies, and you can do anything to them. And I think that's a huge mistake, and it's grounded in a mistake that I would say is traceable throughout Descartes, which is his problem is he doesn't see creation as revealing God. Mm-hmm. So although he gives us some good arguments in one sense, in another sense, he doesn't see creation as revelation. And because of that, he does allow for things like vivisection. And his view of science, even though he was supporting the new science, got really strange. Let me give an example. The Cartesians said of the Newtonians that the Newtonians' view of gravity, which we all accept, is an occult force. Because when you think about gravity doesn't, it's not like dominoes. And the Cartesian view of material cause is like dominoes, where you hit one and it hits the next one and it hits the next one all the way down the line until it hits the last one. But gravity is not like that. It's as if gravity, you knock over a domino right here and it knocks over a domino a mile away without touching anything in between. So they said that's occult, which is like calling it witchcraft. And their view of the world was that mechanistic view, which is a problem. And Newton addressed this very well. He said, I'm not explaining what gravity is. I'm measuring it and telling you the speed at which
what it does.
Given a great speed. Yeah. He even suggested, for all I know, gravity is an action of God, keeping everything together. But I'm not proposing what it is. I'm just telling you how it works or the speed at which it operates. So that was a debate between the Newtonians and the Cartesians, and the Cartesians lost. And you really don't have Cartesians involved in science because they were mechanistic like that anymore. Their view lost. But that's an example of where, Descartes in that sense did have this mechanistic view of the world, which allowed him to say, since animals don't have souls, we can treat them however we want, which doesn't follow.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, and Leroy, you can jump in on this too, do you think that would, the word that came to my mind as I was reading is sort of like proto-deist. I'm not going to say he's a deist, but sort of like he's a proto-deist, beginning to make that God separate from creation, not intimately involved and connected and eminent within the world. I just get that sense as I read him. So fair summary, Leroy, Owen, either one?
Yeah, real quick, it does leave this problem. He gives a proof that the material world exists. It doesn't exist in a mind. It exists as matter. But he didn't really give us a good argument of how the mind and matter interact. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that's a problem with having two substances. I think there are two substances, and you can explain how they interact. But Descartes didn't give us a good one. He suggested that the pineal gland towards the middle of your brain was a special kind of gland that could interact directly with mind, which still doesn't make, it's still just material. How does it's different than the rest of matter? So that is a big problem for Descartes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summation. I think the chief problem that, I'm not a Descartes scholar at all, so I just want to say that the chief problem in my view is the very fact that his view assumes a type of revelation, but it doesn't prove that what that revelation is, which leaves it vulnerable for anybody to come and and have a conception of God that is maybe not the same as a Christian conception of God, but maybe something near similar. And I think had he used his thoughts to interact more diligently with Scripture, he may have arrived at some different conclusions in terms of the mechanistic, dualistic sort of worldview that we end up with through Descartes.
Yeah. So that's a good lead-in. So we see that sees himself as a defender of Christianity, of the God of the Bible in some sense of that, whatever his sense was. And I don't know that I have a clear picture of what exactly that is. And I was, and I'm glad Owen doesn't either, because at least I feel like I tried to do my due diligence and figure something out. So if he hasn't found it, maybe that's because it's not there. So that's good. At least we tried. But he does, in some sense, see himself Christian, theist, somewhere in those categories. Whether he's defending biblical Christianity or not, we'll leave that for another thing. But God is maker, creator in some way, even if he's in some degree separate or removed from that. So there's where we've come from.
Real quick?
Yeah.
Just to say, since we've been saying God a lot, and then Christian God, but let me just say my working definition of God, which is essentially it is the answer to question 4 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. So God is a spirit. That's the substance of God. He's incorporeal. He's not made of matter. And that's directly from Scripture. And God is eternal, infinite, and unchanging. Those are the incommunicable attributes of God that God alone has, the aseity of God. And then God is also has being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Those are properties we can share with God, but we only have them finitely and temporally. And so I mention that definition because it has those 3 parts. What is God? God's a spirit, and then the incommunicable attributes, and then the moral attributes of God. And so in terms of what is a Christian God, I think that's a Christian God. And then you could say, well, what about other religions like Islam or Mormonism? Well, we know Mormonism doesn't teach that. They teach that Jesus is Lucifer's brother, and Jesus' father also had a father. Islam is derivative of Christianity. It has objections to Christianity, and I think its view of God is different, especially on its view of justice and mercy. But it's trying to build on Christianity. So you don't really have other religions besides Christianity or ones that build on it that are theistic, right? Aristotle didn't believe that about. That's not what Plato means by God. So, but it is what Descartes means. So in that sense, he is the Christian God.
Yeah. So then we look at this idea of how can I know the purpose for my life? And I'm thinking of this in terms of what gives us the sense of direction. Is there this ultimate purpose or not? Do we just decide it ourselves? And so I wanted to, I'll kind of throw in some information that I thought was relevant here, and then I'll let you guys jump in with your thoughts, what you go from here and what you want to add to that. So my sort of, as I read through, here's my sort of summary that I had. For the animal function, we'll go back to that. Function follows the mechanistic form. We saw that in part 5 that we discussed a minute ago. So Descartes supports this through an argument about the structures of the heart. And there's a gal named Dorothea Hirsch who argues he was influenced by the alchemists of his day and may provide possible clues to Descartes' choice of fire as a motivator of or reason for cardiac movement. And there's a whole section he talks about fire and the heart and flame that keeps it going. And it was really interesting. It got me looking up what is his view of heart. It was so fascinating. But it seemed like he's tying human impetus to physical things. So our motivations are tied to physical parts of our body, different things. Like you were saying earlier, Owen, point to part of your brain, and this is where mind is. Point to your desires. They come from this part of a body. So there's a physicalist sense to that, mechanistic to some degree. This, again, is as a non-deep Cartesian scholar would take it. And so I think this at least opens the door. And I'm going to jump on this. I'm going to throw a little hand grenade in here because I think Owen resisted this earlier. But this is still my thinking. When he says, for a human then to think, therefore I am, I think this leads to a loss of really enduring identity. I think in the sense that even if he's not responsible for all that's gone bad in the last 500 years of the world, I think he does open this idea that somehow that idea that I think, therefore I am, shapes the fact that we can purpose ourselves for some future. And the passage that came to mind comes actually from Martine Rothblatt, the book, The Apartheid of Sex. And this was originally in 1995, and there's a revision called Transgender to Transhumanism, which was published in 2010. And the quote here is, transhumans welcome one mind, many forms, the way transgenders welcome one mind, many genders. Just as societies enumerators adapted to multiple races, they will adapt to multiple sexes and ultimately multiple forms. But the idea that somehow, if you can conceive it, you can become it, I still think, at least in a purpose level, even if ontologically or epistemically there's some distinction where Descartes intended it and where it's come down, where he started, it seems like that's where it's, in terms of practical terms, taken the culture. And I know there's a lot of, we're going to go through a lot of other philosophers and they can be blamed for a lot of other bad things. So it's not like a direct line from Descartes to Rothblatt. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm saying I think that I see those ideas at least latent within Descartes. So I'll take from there. Is that where he would leave purpose for us? Is that, I mean, again, is that maybe it is a total distortion where the culture has taken that, but that's what I hear when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
Leroy, why don't you jump in first, man?
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, Leroy, please go. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because it seems like taking the statement, I think, therefore I am, without understanding the contours of his philosophy, the context in which his words were spoken, I mean, might lead someone to ground thought and to ground reality and to ground identity in themselves and their own ability to, to think about things, right? I mean, so in one sense, if we were to understand Descartes in his own context and his own words and kind of figure it out there, we might arrive at a different answer to that question. Whereas if we just take the popular, understanding of what we think that he's doing there, then of course, grounding, the thought and reality within your own ability to figure out, of course, it is going to lead, people to thinking that identity is what I think it is and what I want to make it up to be. I mean, that seems to me to be the logical step, but I can see, and I'm just anticipating that no one might argue that there's a distinction between those kind of three issues.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and take it away, man.
I think let me think, to blame the things that you're blaming, I would say the better person to blame would be the hedonists who say that the good is whatever satisfies my desires. And so utilitarianism that might make satisfaction of desire the highest good. That's what happiness is. And so that's a lot closer to our time period also. And that shifts the focus to me, which is what these authors are concerned about, is making me the arbiter of reality. And once we make my desires the most important thing, then we have indeed done that. And so that's a problem. But Descartes doing the exact opposite of that. He's saying, not I think it, therefore it's real. He's only using the cogito to say, I know something exists, me, because I'm thinking. And Augustine said the exact same thing in his essay on the Trinity. So I think it's a valid argument. It's a good argument. And then from there, Descartes is asking us to submit to the authority of reason. He's not saying just believe whatever I say. He's saying there's something called reason. And we can use, especially the reductio ad absurdum argument, because he loved geometry, to prove things. So you really can't get subjectivism out of Descartes. He's not making the human mind absolute. God is definitely the creator still. So I wonder about these persons kind of reading back into that. My suspicion is that they're secular and don't understand what was going on in Christian philosophy at the time, or if they're Christian, they're worried about his division between the mind and the body. They may not be aware that other Christian philosophers, I keep mentioning Augustine because Descartes is basically Augustinian on these points. Mm-hmm. They said the same thing. There's matter and there's mind.
Yeah. So let me give a couple quick quotes on this because I use these. I've talked about these before. For me, again, this is my take on Descartes, is that I think he used that idea of I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, as this, not just an epistemic claim, but I think there's an I felt like there's an ontological claim to him, right? In that idea. So here's a couple quotes. This one comes on Meditations and First Philosophy. He says this: nothing which is such that I can doubt whether it exists actually exists. Every body is such that I can doubt whether it exists. Therefore, no body actually exists. And then from Discourses, he says this: from that, I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is to think, and that for its existence there is no need for any place, nor does it depend on any material thing. So he's saying the essence of who he is doesn't depend on any material reality. It's completely independent and autonomous from that. And I think that's where I make that jump and say, okay, well, if my essence of who I am is separate and wholly distinct from any physical place, presence, time, or physical reality, then whatever I think is what I become, and I can become that independent of the material thing that I perceive, because what I perceive might be a dream. He talks a lot about dreaming and those sort of things. So that's where I'm stuck with Descartes. That's why I do struggle to see him not opening up the door for that, because it seems like he does. So thoughts on that, Owen? Correct me.
Yeah, the first quote you gave is him positing what he ends up rejecting. So as you read through the meditations, he'll say, what if there's an evil demon who makes this whole world I see? So he doesn't believe there is an evil demon. He's positing the opposite. So he doesn't believe matter doesn't exist. He's saying, what if I can doubt things? And he is pointing out that matter isn't a necessary existence because I can doubt it. But he does end up showing the material world exists. And on the second quote, he never says, I can think myself to be anything. That's a whole different view of that he would reject. But he says, I'm not essentially a body. I'm essentially a mind. And I think Christians would agree with that, because we know that our bodies will die and turn into dust, but we still exist. Whereas if we were essentially a body, then when our bodies die, we would no longer exist. And our resurrected body, although it will be related to this body, will also have differences. And so when he says think or mind, he means soul, that we have an immortal soul. And that's what makes me who I am. My body, if my soul and my body were parted, my body would just lay there and do nothing. And it wouldn't say, hi, I'm Owen. Whereas I would still be thinking that I'm Owen. So that, I think those things are things that Christians would accept as true about the soul.
Leroy.
Yeah, that gets back to his eschatology. I mean, a topic that he may not talk exactly about, but yeah, I mean, if he's arguing for the persistence of the soul, and then he's obviously got a robust eschatological view, even if he never articulates it, right? I mean, if the soul persists, I don't know how he would answer the question, what happens to the soul after the body dies? But he's at least arguing that the soul does persist after death. His may be a discussion on the mind-body problem or dualism in a germinal perspective, but at least he's beginning to ask the questions, right? Or at least lead us some breadcrumbs to the answers that we might, or the questions we might form, and then the answer we might get from those questions, because he's thinking eschatologically here.
Yeah. The first quote you mentioned, he's talking about the demon and the guy stuff. Yeah. It's an interesting passage though, in that whole thing where he's like, a demon might make me think this, or I might have a bad dream about these, he go in his different going back and forth on that. And I know there's certain ideas he rejects, but it seems like his rejection of it isn't clearly connected with his philosophical reasoning. I don't
say he doesn't give a good argument.
I'm not sure he gives a good argument. I think go ahead.
Well, I was going to say he lived before the Matrix. After the Matrix, every philosophy professor just uses the Matrix to make the same point. But he didn't have the Matrix. He said, "What if there's an evil demon doing this to me?"
Yeah. So that part is really interesting to me. I think his argument at least seems weak in that sense, and I just feel like that door is open. So I would consider myself a Thomist in terms of that sort of sense of dualist, but not a Cartesian dualist in his sense, because I do think I would say that the body, the physical reality of who we are, I don't think is an accidental property for sure. I do think God created the soul and the body to coexist. Ideally, they would have existed without end, except for sin entering in. So we do have a temporal separation of the soul from the body, but that's a consequence of God having to deal with the sin problem and how he brings about salvation. So somehow, though I do think I would say that the physical is still an essential part of who we are. Even in Christ, the resurrected body, there's a physical essential nature to the physical material reality of who we are, even if it's transformed in some way in the kingdom yet to come. But I wouldn't say it's non-essential, the physical side in that way. So that's at least where I would land on that.
You mind if I ask a question? Do you think that his argument may be that a soul exists and a soul persists, rather than, and maybe articulating the reality of the one, rather than, and focusing merely on that, than going the full, discussion. Because if we look at how these discussions progress, they don't all start off with all the parts of that they in the beginning that they'll end up with at the end. I mean, maybe I think that's what's
Yeah.
going on here.
Yeah, well, and I 100% agree, and Christianity agrees that also teaches what you just said, Joe, which is we're a body-soul unity. So it is true that the pagan systems tended to view us as a soul stuck in a body trying to get out after reincarnation. So we reject that view. And I don't think he's suggesting that we aren't made to exist with a body, but he's using the word essential differently than you are.
Oh, okay. So not for example, in the current
I could be
philosophical
Owen.
sense.
Yeah, I mean, I could be Owen, but have two noses. I'd still be Owen. It'd look weird. But
yeah, you could miss an arm. You could have an arm removed. Yeah. Okay.
But if I didn't think, I don't mean that I'm in a coma for a little while or I'm sleeping for 8 hours. I mean, I don't even have the property of thinking. Then that's an essential difference, though. So that's what he's getting at is, and this really lays the basis for the universality of humanity, which is very important for us in the modern world. And that brings us back that your physical features aren't what makes you a human. Where you were born does not make you a human. The time you live in does not make you a human. And so that's really opening the door to remember I said earlier, he's looking for the universal. And so he's looking for, what is it that universally makes everyone across the globe a human? And he's landing on that we have a soul, which I think Christianity would say, yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in that sense, animals don't have a soul.
Yeah. So, for both of you then,
when he speaks about forms, he means something different than a soul, a rational soul.
Yeah. So for both of you then, give me a couple sentence summary then. If we're saying, how would Descartes say that we discover our purpose as humans, given that there's this sort of God who's somewhat disconnected? We can't observe the world and discover that God. Is it from the Bible itself? Is it just from thinking about purpose? What is your summary as you read that you think is the source of discovering purpose if we follow Descartes' thinking for that? How would he answer that question?
Leroy to go first.
But it's a good question, because for Descartes, here's how I would think about it. I would think that if we assume that that there aren't very many rival conceptions of God that he's working with, the idea of the Christian God, as Owen explained earlier, then he would argue our reflection on that God and his character, and through thinking and through reasoning, through thinking and through reasoning, we would be able to, become what God intends us to become, right? If our reflection is on that God, because again, if we look at it through his, his ethical system, his, epistemology, and his metaphysical view, they're all of a piece, right? They're all of a piece. They all depend on that conception of God. And if we're going to, understand that he's not working with, many views of God that we would be working today, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, deism, whatever. And he's got this one view in mind, that he gets from Augustine. Then it's easy to see how, it's assumed, it's built into the assumption of his system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I would just add that he does say it's not enough to have a mind, you have to use it well. So he'd say, use your mind to know the truth about God. So that's great. I do wonder, I don't have a quote for this, but I do wonder if he was caught up in what many people even today get caught up in, which is that somehow heaven is our highest good. So if you're a Christian and you do what you need to do as a Christian, when you die, you go to a happy place. And I think that view is more connected to the Roman view of the Elysian fields than it is to the Christian view of eschatology, where whether it's in this life or it's in the intermediate state or it's after the resurrection, our chief end is to glorify God. That's our highest good. Whereas people still, it's very common. I mentioned earlier how pagans would teach this, and people think it, even when they're not pagans, is that escaping the body and going to a spirit realm is the best thing that can happen to you because there's no suffering there.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder if we dug into it, if we might find him talking that way about heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess my short answer to this, and Daphne has a question I'm going to put up here in just 1 second and get your thoughts on this. But I think my short answer to purpose might just be, I think it's in part 4. I'm drawing a blank exactly what part, but he just talks about how you live according to the customs of the culture, the place where you're at least until you come up with your formal sort of. This might get even to the question, what's the right thing to do in any given situation. But I think he would say at some point you live by the customs until you can tear away everything else. And once you tear away all the stuff that's not real, then you discover your purpose through that process. Probably not very satisfying to just say it simply like that. But I mean, in terms of, it's not like a step 1, 2, 3 that he gives. It's more of a complex thing than that for finding purpose. But that to say, Daphne has a question there. I kind of popped it up at the top there. She says, how does this apply to the faith and reason? So I'm assuming Daphne's asking, we often see in the modern context, faith is the opposite of reason and reason is the opposite of, they're at odds. Would Descartes see reason as a superior attribute of human existence better than faith? Does he see them as enemies? What would be his take on that faith reason thing? So that's a great question from Daphne.
Yeah, so let me give it a setting here, since we were talking about Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas as the Christian who tried to fuse Aristotle with Christianity. And what Thomas Aquinas says is that we can't from reason know that the material world was created by God. Reason, in fact, he says, gives some really good arguments to say that it is eternal. It existed from eternity. That's what Aristotle thought. One of the very first philosophers was named Johannes Philoponus, and his main book was Against Aristotle and the Eternality of the World. And so that faith.
I want to be a Philoponus. I'm sorry, but you got me at Philoponus. I think that's awesome.
John, the horse lover.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
He's also Johannes Grammaticus. I think he had 2 names.
Philoponus is cooler.
But the point is just that you have this tension between faith and reason from Aquinas then, saying that the only way we know God made the world, created the world with a beginning, is from Genesis. And so I think a lot of Christians have just adopted that view, that faith means things you can't know and you have to be told by God. But I think Descartes might have accepted that, but also been providing us with a solution that's closer to the biblical solution that Paul gives. Although you guys are theologians, you can get mad at me that I say Paul wrote Hebrews. But in Hebrews, faith is defined as the evidence of things not seen. So it's not contrary to reason, it's evidence, it's proof, but it's the topic. The topic is things we don't see with our eyes, like God's existence. And so faith has to do with believing God's promises and living according to them. But the example of this that's given in Hebrews is Abraham, where it says he reasoned that God could raise Isaac from the dead. So that was both an article of faith and also something he reasoned out for himself. So the medieval world gave us this tension between faith and reason. I think Descartes actually provides us with a way to break that tension and get back to a biblical definition of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Descartes' system has assumption built right into it. Some people think that Descartes' system leads to extreme skepticism, right? I think that rationality leads to extreme skepticism. I often start my class and I ask students in my class, okay, I said, you all seen the head of an axe, right? They say, of course, you know what that is. It's metal, right? I said, so what if the head of an axe fell in the sea? Can the head of an axe float?
If you're a witch, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Monty Python.
And the students all will say, no, the head of an axe can't float. And then we begin our discussion because you've assumed that in all situations the head of an axe can't float, but there are some unique situations in which the head of an axe can float, and that's if God is already assumed in the equation. So the answer to the question is, can the head of the axe float? It depends. It depends on the situation, and I think if we take Descartes at face value and argue that his system assumes God in the middle of it, in the midst of it, then Descartes isn't isn't leading us to extreme skepticism. What he may be leading us to is an extreme faith that God is active in the world and working, as opposed to, Aristotle, who might argue slightly differently. At least, I mean,
Yeah, I
that's what
do
it seems
think
to be.
that Descartes, just building off what Leroy said, he does just like with the mind and the body. And I told you he thought the pineal gland solves that problem. He does raise, because of his mechanistic view, problems about miracles, which later on Hume capitalizes on in his argument against miracles. So I'm not saying Descartes couldn't have solved that. I don't know that he did solve that problem of how miracles occur, because he had this view of the world as being mechanistic that made his followers even have a problem with Newtonian gravity. And so that's because of his view of how causation works, though, not because of his view of mind and matter.
Yeah, so we're pushing up on where we won't go too much longer for the sake of those listening along, but I do want to get to at least two more of our 6 worldview questions. And I do think questions 3, 4, and 5 really kind of can be compressed together for this, because those questions are: what is the right thing to do? How can I fulfill my purpose? And how will my life be judged? And I think in some degree we can kind of take those on as a collective. So when it comes to what is the right thing to do, what is the moral good, what is just, what is right, all those things, how does Descartes give us a framework to understand that? Is there an absolute moral truth, the moral good? Is it purely subjective? Does it depend on the culture? Does it depend on the mind of the individual? How would he frame the idea of moral good? Don't everyone jump in at once. I'll just leave it to you guys.
I think he might say that we need to conform our will to what God's is. I think I wrote in my notes here: humans should strive to align their will with God's, as God is the representative of ultimate good. Thus, the pursuit of virtue for Descartes involves seeking to act in a manner that reflects the goodness and perfection of God. I mean, that's what I wrote down in my notes. So for him, that would just come from our reflection on God.
So, but would that be tied to the revelation of Scripture? Is he going to say that the Scripture is the revealed truth about who God is, or does he divorce God from connected to the actual concept of revelation? So is it just my thoughts about God? What do you think is good? No, that's what I'm asking. Like, let's make that clear. How would he connect that? Yeah. Go ahead, Owen, if you want to jump in on that.
I don't think you would doubt that. I think you got to remember, this is, let's just roughly say 1650. So this really skeptical philosophers come later. He's really operating within a Christian context there. So he doesn't give us answers to some of these questions because we're living on the other side of those skeptics and we want to have answers to those questions. He's still really firmly in even France is still Christian, right? So within 100 years, the French philosophers are atheists, but that's just not the case during his time. So I'm not sure he directly raises those questions because he hasn't had.
Yeah, I didn't get anything from it either. That's why I was curious.
Yeah. That's why I thought that.
I think that's one reason God raises up those kinds of questions, is makes us deal with them.
Yeah. Good, Leroy?
I think for him, these answers are all assumed. They're all, baked into the cake. It's like we're asking him to deal with issues that for them were not, had not yet begun to be an issue. Right. So we kind of have to ensconce ourselves into that particular worldview and how they understood it to see how his answers in this question toward this question might come out. And if he's assuming, that our goal is to conform our will to God's will. I mean, it would have to be the God of Scripture, right? It would have to be, it would have to include, Scripture, even though he doesn't feel the need to bring it into the equation.
Yeah. So we have to assume there's no evidence that certainly says he rejected that. So it's sort of, there's no reason for us to think that he did reject that. There's no evidence on our side to say, oh, he rejected that for sure. We may not like his philosophy in some ways. We may not like what he does and some of his arguments, but there's no clear evidence that he would be rejecting the Bible as some source of knowledge about the nature of God or of right and wrong or moral goodness, right? Is that, we all kind of in agreement on that? Is that what the summary is? Okay, good. Perfect. Well, then let's jump to the last question, because I think that, again, that connects to how to fulfill purpose. I think you could see that within the scriptural framework, at least his thinking, because he doesn't address that directly. And I didn't sense it either. I have no notes in that section. That's why I was really just like, sorry, we may not spend a lot of time on these, because I'm not sensing anything in this writing, and I didn't want to put words in his mouth. But I did want to try to help people see that there's some way to these questions could be addressed, but maybe just not through Descartes directly. So how might life be judged? Let's assume that's some sort of biblical framework. What happens when I die? What is his view of the life after the physical? I don't recall reading anything in that. So I'm pulling on
about the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah. So you're not familiar with anything on that?
Doubt it.
Yeah.
I think he just takes that kind of thing for granted.
Okay. So there's some sort of resurrection of the dead. There's some sort of physical reality that he would believe, because the Bible seems to push that direction. We wouldn't become like in a modern sense where you have people becoming enlightened and they become these spiritual force beings that are independent of the physical. Yeah. He wouldn't be thinking along those lines in any way. So when he's saying, I think, therefore I am, the mind is the essence of who I am, he's not ultimately saying that eternality is the absence of the physical in a Gnostic sense. He's not denying the potential goodness of the physical in some eternal sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think on that point, he's probably Augustinian, that being is good.
Okay. Yeah, because nothing came out clearly, but I did want to at least try to faithfully deal with those worldview questions to see if we couldn't come up with something. So that I'm leaning on Owen Anderson. For anybody who disagrees, write Owen at Owen Anderson at IamMadAtYou.com.
Yeah, go to my Substack.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, let's do that. Actually. So those are the worldview questions. So we won't have to go any deeper beyond that. I think our first part of that is where the really deep stuff for Descartes, because that's really where his world of writing is. The essence of knowledge, epistemology, ontology, and that's really where his work lives. So these later questions, they're important worldview questions. We don't have a lot of clarity, so we just kind of assume maybe he was a man of his times in those areas, which I think is good. I'm glad we could at least bring that out, because that's helpful to me personally to kind of think that way. And maybe I won't be so mad at Descartes, and I won't be such an angry anti-Descartes guy. So Owen maybe will get me to think kindly words of him in my sleep. So so we'll go with that. But so Owen, this is your first time here. Where can people find or connect with you offline here, or off this show, but online?
So I use Dr. Owen Anderson, so Dr. Owen Anderson, across most of my social media. So I'm pretty active on Substack, where one of the things I keep everyone updated on is persecution I face at ASU as a secular institution for being a Christian. And so I'm involved in some lawsuits right now about that. So I keep people updated about that, but also post about my work. And then on Twitter, I tend to keep up to date more just on what's going on in philosophy and the world. So both of those are Dr. Owen Anderson.
Okay, perfect. And also, just so people are aware, I have Owen's Substack linked in my recommendations on mine. So if you've already been to my Substack, go to the recommendations. He's there. When this podcast episode goes live, which should be in a couple days, also, he's listed as a co-author of the podcast. So if you hover over his little image there, you'll be able to link right through to him. And also Leroy's Substack, because he's starting to get into this as well. So I know you can find him there on Substack. Anywhere else you want to promote, Leroy, that you're active, or do you want people to go right to your Substack and leave you angry messages?
Nope, not active anywhere else.
Okay.
Possibly.
I need to get a little cartoon guy like you guys have.
I know. Well, that's why I always feel bad to guess. You have to come definitely more than 5 times to get a cartoon guy. So you made your cartoon guy, right, Leroy? I think I made one originally, but I think you made this guy, right?
Oh yeah, you made a very ridiculous one.
Yeah, it was a horrible one.
Always the coolest one.
Mine was cooler, definitely.
Yours was always the coolest one. Mine was horrible.
Yeah, well, that was your motivation to get into to make your own cartoon guy. All right, so
thanks for having me on. It's so much fun. I really enjoyed meeting you, Leroy, and always enjoy talking with you, Joe.
Yes. All right, brothers. Well, I appreciate it. Hey, so make sure everyone joins back in with us, not just for this, but once a month we're going to be going through. Next month we've got Hobbes, Leviathan, and we've got another guest coming on for that. And then after that, I can't even remember what the topic is after that, to be honest. Can't think that far ahead. But Dr. A will be back with us for that topic in 2 months. So hopefully you'll join us for those things. Take care, everyone. God bless. Thanks for joining. Hopefully you got some good stuff out of this. There's a lot more to say about Descartes and the influence of his ideas, but for now, go out and raise the roof on his mechanistic view of nature and proto-deism. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service, and if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.